So we kind of thought we'd have a bit of a conversation about mindful living and how it kind of pertains to pain management and living well with pain, and some of our kind of thoughts and experiences and the difference it can make. So Mark, do you want to say a bit about kind of, well, what is mindful living?
Yeah, I think best place to start there would be our volunteer, Mark. Would you like to kick things off, Mark, with that?
Yeah, I think mindful living is all about noticing the present moment. It's about not allowing your thoughts to take over, especially if you've got a long-term health condition. It's very easy to get into this particular mindset of allowing your mind just to race ahead all the time. Very easy to start thinking about things from a very catastrophic point of view, spending a lot of time grieving about how things used to be and worrying about how things are going to be in the future. And so I think one of the great things about mindful living is that it teaches you just to stay in the present moment and notice what's happening at that present moment. It helps to calm down your mind from thinking about all the things that are constantly churning around inside it.
So it kind of has a soothing effect on the nervous system, which I guess is so important in pain management. Like a lot of the kind of theories around how our pain systems are kind of wired to be on alert because pain has the function of signaling danger. But with persistent pain, it's kind of, the wires have got a bit mixed up in a way. So we need to kind of dampen down that signal, and sometimes mindful living can help a bit with that, both with the thought processes associated with winding up the system and also the physiological kind of tension associated.
Yeah, definitely.
With the system.
Exactly. I think one of the things that sometimes can happen is the fact that you're already at that, threat level before you even notice that you're there, and you've got all these feelings inside. You're experiencing the pain, etc. And it's using mindful living enables you just to bring that down a level, enabling you to recognize that the pain may still be there. In many cases, you experience less pain, but you don't need to catastrophize as much as you would necessarily do if you allowed things to spiral out of control.
Mm-hmm.
And that fits a lot in with an author of 2 books, Vidyamala, Burch, who wrote quite extensively about mindfulness for health. And she talks about the mindful living approach alongside pain can be viewing pain as 2 experiences, a primary experience and a secondary experience, or response. And a primary response to pain, of course, would be that physical feeling of pain. But a lot of her work concentrates on those secondary responses as well. So the emotional side of pain. Again, you mentioned catastrophic thinking, those sort of thinking styles that, as Becky mentioned, when we are in that threat mode, begin to appear more and more. She discusses that mindful living can be a good approach in terms of noticing when those threat responses are occurring, and yet to ground yourself in the present and to notice more that they are happening.
Yeah, definitely. And I think as well, one of the things that Vidyamala talks about is the 2 arrows. So we have the first arrow that, is in a sense the condition that you may have, the pain you're experiencing, etc. And then the second arrow, those arrows that we tend to fire into ourselves. Oh, I'm in pain, this will never change, etc. My life is never going to be how it used to be. How on earth am I going to cope with pain? This pain's unbearable, etc. And so we have a tendency then to fire those secondary arrows into ourselves. And what mindful living teaches you to do is to stop firing those secondary arrows.
And what difference has that made to your experience of living with a health condition to kind of explore mindful living?
It's made a huge difference, to be honest with you. I'm a lot more accepting of my health condition. At one stage, I would do anything to try to avoid how I felt. I felt in many senses though I was becoming that particular health condition. That was my label, that was my identity. And with mindful living, it's taught me that there is actually a hope in my life, that things can be different, and that in many senses, even though I do still experience pain, that pain level isn't as high as it used to be, because the fact I'm not constantly firing those secondary arrows. And it's made a massive change. I started off by, before I encountered mindful living, I'd got to the point where I was just wanting to stay in the house all the time. I didn't want to go out. didn't want to be in pain, didn't want to have the thoughts of being in pain, etc. And so what it's taught me to do is to, rather than to resist how I'm feeling, I now allow myself to accept how I'm feeling. So it's, instead of this idea of, we say that whatever you resist persists. And so with my health condition now, I have a much more accepting attitude towards it. Instead of treating it as an enemy, I treat it more as a friend. And I notice when I'm in pain, how the pain feels. I become curious about it. Does it feel hot? Does it feel cold? Does it feel tense? Does it, what are those symptoms, etc.? And just accepting that that's how it is at this moment in time, and living in this present moment, rather than worrying about how things might be in 10 minutes' time, or how things could be in 2 years' time, etc.
And the fascinating thing, I think, about that is obviously the difference it makes to how you live your life and cope with the presence of something kind of unwanted and challenging in your life. And also that's really backed up by all the evidence from the fMRIs, isn't it, Mark?
That's right, yeah. So there is a number of studies, research out there which does look at functional brain scans. And the good news is when they looked at people who did have persistent pain, who had been did mindful living approaches and exercises, there was 2 areas of the brain that did show a lot of difference. What we will have mentioned in other videos is that pain by nature is an emotional response. And upon looking at the functional brain scans, looking at that emotional side of the brain, the area of the brain that basically processes our emotion and expresses itself in emotions, whilst pain was being experienced, that part of the brain was a little bit quieter. To use a bit of an unscientific description, but it was a little bit more quieter, which is good news. And secondly as well, in also those functional brain scans as well, the area of the brain that does process pain as well was slightly quieter as well, compared to people who didn't take part and practice mindful living strategies. So this is really fascinating for us who are delivering it in a community pain service, because once mindful living was maybe seen as a bit of a fluffy intervention in terms of breathing, but to back it up with real science, real functions, and noticing the brain changing, I think it's great news. It's fascinating for me to have started in this service and not really knowing about the ins and outs of the effect it can have on pain, but to see that has been quite significant in terms of our work and delivering it to patients.
I think even just the breathing side of mindful living can be so powerful, can't it? And certainly kind of heard our physio talk about how he will teach people to breathe in response to moving in a more relaxed, and that helps with movement in a more relaxed way rather than movement in a tensed kind of threat-based way. So even something as simple as someone kind of learning to do some deep breathing and exhaling a bit slower on the out breath, we know can make such a difference to people's nervous system.
Yeah, definitely. And I think as well as that, once you start adopting these particular techniques, once you introduce mindful living into your life, it kind of permeates through the rest of your life as well. And so you find that you do slow down. A lot of things that you do, you actually notice much clearer. In many senses, I like to use an analogy of the old Wizard of Oz film, where at one stage, at the beginning of the film, everything's in black and white. And I've found with mindful living that once you start adopting some of these particular techniques, like, for example, the breathing and maybe the body scan as well, which can be very powerful, it's as though your whole world becomes colorized, a bit like that particular film.
Yes, yeah.
And it makes such a difference, because it does enable you just to slow down. And from a pain point of view as well, I found that it actually reduces the amount of pain that you experience. Yes. That secondary pain isn't there as much as it used to be when you're constantly thinking about the pain and focusing on it.
And I've heard you talk in the past, Mark, about a practical example of where you bring that colour into practice and slow things down. Sort of waiting in traffic was once quite a difficult, not a difficult thing, but a frustrating thing, and now it's one of the things that you might look forward to.
Yeah, definitely. Traffic lights are one of my favourite times, actually. Sitting at traffic lights and just noticing what's happening, for example, something as simple as just watching the clouds move across the sky, etc. Just having that comma, if you like, that pause, and just becoming aware of this present moment can be such a powerful way of living. And rather than, like I said before, worrying about what could happen in the future or how things are going to be for you in the future, but just staying in that present moment, living moment by moment. I think that's one of the great things that the breathing teaches you, because for a lot of people it's kind of like, oh right, I'm going to now learn to breathe mindfully. Well, what about the next breath and to do the last breath properly? And you've missed out 3 or 4 different breaths because you're trying to focus on one thing or another. And the beautiful thing about mindful living is that it's not a doing thing, but it's just a being thing. It's just noticing moment by moment by moment.
And I love what you said there, Mark, actually about noticing, because when we're thinking about solution-focused approaches in psychology, we do quite a lot of work in asking people, inviting them to notice their experiences of what they'd like to see more of. And the analogy always comes to mind for me is if anyone's ever going to go and buy a new car, you suddenly see that new car everywhere, or that make of car everywhere. You seem to spot it. You're on the lookout for it.
Definitely.
So in relation to, again, you talk a lot about this, Becky, as well, in terms of cultivating soothing responses and improving as much soothing as possible compared to threat. The invitation to notice things like your clouds in the sky and the traffic jam would be a good, worthwhile experience to do, particularly in mindful living.
Well, it's kind of all about attention, isn't it? And attentional skills in a lot of ways. So pain is evolutionary designed to grab your attention, to tell you there's something wrong, do something different here. The trouble is in persistent pain, that function isn't particularly useful, and actually it stops people kind of living their lives. So mindful living kind of hones the brain to allow the pain to grab less attention in a way, because you're expanding the brain's attentional capacity to notice other aspects of experience as well as the presence of pain.
Yeah, definitely. And it's not as though you're just trying to distract yourself, or I'm intentionally trying to distract yourself. You're actually enjoying this present moment. And even though you may be experiencing pain, you can still, rather than trying to resist it, you can actually draw close to it. And I think that's one of the most powerful things that I learned, was the fact that rather than trying to, push it away, having an acceptance towards it can be such a powerful way of living, because you don't have all that tension that you automatically have in your body through frustration or fear, etc., anxiety. All those things dissipate for the simple reason that you are a lot more accepting of this is how it is. You're not turning around and trying to be false and saying, oh, it's not there. You know it's there, but you're not denying it. And by not denying it and by having a more accepting attitude of it, personally, I found it does help to reduce that level of pain that you experience.
Yeah, and we can't turn off our danger response, our threat response, because that would involve kind of turning off your brain, and I don't think that would be great for people either. We've got that kind of bit in our brain, the lizard brain in evolutionary terms, that is designed for fight or flight, to fight the predator or get away from the predator, and that our brains have that part in them to survive. That's how we've survived as a species all these many years. The problem being in modern life is that fight or flight can be triggered by the smallest of thing now, because the brain doesn't kind of distinguish between, the fear you experience from a letter coming in that might be a bill and you feel like you can't pay, and there's a whole cognitive kind of stream of consciousness around that, but there's also that automatic trigger of the fight or flight response.
Yeah.
And it can't differentiate between that and, a big tiger coming to get us. So actually exploring ways to activate the brain and the body's kind of natural soothing systems and allowing space for that to come online means it's more likely that won't be kind of quite as triggery kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. I think for a lot of people, we live life on default mode, and being able to live in a mindful way enables you to really just recognize the fact that sometimes we do things automatically, and those things are not necessarily going to be helpful for us. So when you think about, thinking, for example, it's very easy, is it not, just to go straight to that worst case scenario, because that, in a sense, is what our brains are programmed to do, to look for that threat, etc., that constantly might or might not be there. And I think one of the beautiful things about mindful living is it teaches you that actually You don't need to live in that constant where is the threat, etc. Because you're staying in that moment, and this moment is okay.
Yeah. You're not in drive mode, you're not in problem solving mode. You're in just this moment, I'm kind of safe mode.
Yes.
And it's reassuring for your nervous system, and that's why the brain changes on scans, pre and post people learning mindful approaches.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I think it's very closely aligned to, the solution-focused approach that we have here, because we do ask questions that are curious around when people are already noticing they're feeling more soothed, or, when was your last good day? And people then begin to describe perhaps moments where all of that good work's happening already. And we can go ahead and build on that and give it a bit of a name in terms of, it sounds like you've been a bit mindful there. Would you like to know more about that? I remember talking to a chap a few years ago now who visited Liverpool city centre every weekend for most of his life. He really enjoyed going. But he made a sort of stance of visiting almost as a visitor to that city for the first time. And was seeing detail and things that he'd never seen before.
Yeah, being a curious observer.
He was noticing detail in the live buildings. He was noticing details in pavements, and even surprised a friend in that he saw a rainbow where oil had spread across a puddle. Yeah, things that he would normally miss. So yes.
Why do we think that has such relevance to pain management? Why is that so important?
I think what Mark mentioned before about turning down the autopilot. This idea of two paths and maybe standing at the front, sort of face of both of them and deciding which path you might want to go on. Yeah. Would you agree, Mark? What would be your thoughts?
I would totally agree with that. I mean, I do a lot of walking and walking mindfully and just noticing things. And if I am experiencing pain, listening to the bird song that's, twittering around me, etc., or listening to the sounds of the cars going past, etc., and just tuning into that. And it just gives you a much more rich tapestry of all the senses. It's one of the things that I've found as well is that it's like your senses become heightened. It's a heightened awareness because you're able just to focus on what's happening at that moment in time and being able to just allow everything that you're experiencing at that particular moment just to wash over you in a sense. And so again, I found that's very helpful with pain because again, for me, it's as though I'm focusing on what's happening at this moment, and everything just naturally seems to dial down. So I'm not having to do anything. I'm not having to think about trying to, change my breathing or do anything. I'm just noticing how I'm breathing and noticing the things around me, and that really helps to reduce tension, and stress, and obviously physical pain as well.
Great, thanks.